everybody. Welcome to this edition of the John Thomas Hill podcast, and I'm John Thomas Hill. In case you didn't know from the fact that the show is named John Thomas Hill. But there you go. Anyhow, this is a podcast I'm going to be doing on the NaNoWriMo project, which is, for those of you who don't know, November is National Novel Writing Month. And the group NaNoWriMo has a challenge for prospective writers to do 50,000 words in 30 days. I've done this 3 different times in the past. It's been some time since I've done it, and I've been stuck on a sequel to my first novel, Through the Hourglass, and now I'm working on my my second one, past the Hourglass, but I've been having some trouble with it. So what I've decided to do, instead of doing that, I am going to instead be doing a nonfiction book called A View from the Hill. And the reason it's called A View from the Hill is back when I was in high school and in college, I did a column called View from the Hill, which was basically a general column about the news of the day, whatever. It was basically a commentary about the events of the day, whether they be about what's going on in the news, what's going on in sports, or whatever else is going on. So what I've decided to do is I'm going to write an outline of what I want to talk about in this novel, this book, and to basically write 50,000 words on that outline. Now, it's going to cover some things going on that's gone on in the last 50 years, both politically, economically, socially, and culturally. And it's going to be from my perspective, which is rather mainstream, moderate. I lean a little left on some things, lean a little right on some things. I'm not defined one way or the other, so there is that. But what I want to talk about in this particular podcast is I'm going to talk about some of the things I'll be talking about in that book. And first of all, I'm going to be talking about how things have changed from when I was a kid to what they are right now. Part of that will be technologically. Back when I was 10 years old, 40 years ago, we only had 3 major broadcast networks, plus PBS, plus some independent stations. So the selection was very limited. VCRs were very new at the time, still very much expensive, so for a poor family like ourselves, they were out of the question. And video games were just really starting to hit the mainstream. You had them in arcades, but the home systems were really not coming around to be affordable until the late 70s, early 80s, with Atari and Intellivision and ColecoVision and whatnot. I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about how we shop. Everybody talks about Walmart these days, but 40 years ago, Sears was the place to go. And we've seen what has happened to Sears. We've seen what's happened to Kmart, and why so many of these places have declined in the years that have come to pass. One of the things I want to really talk about in this is not just the stuff about, what about how conservative politics has really transformed itself over the last 40 years. I'll get into that, don't get me wrong. But I'm going to talk a lot about broadcasting. I'm going to talk about a lot of radio. I'm talking a lot about music. I'll talk a lot about television. I'll talk a lot about what's going on in the world today and why it's changed so much and why it's not necessarily for the best. And part of why I'll be writing this book is I'm going to basically give you my view about how things can be better, not just for the nation, but for the world at large. And it's just one man's perspective, one man's view of the world. There are plenty of people with more knowledge than I have, more experience than I have, and all of that. But I will definitely put my thoughts out there. Vast majority of you will probably not agree with every little thing I talk about. I would not be surprised by that. But I will put my viewpoint out there nonetheless. I'm big into media. I've studied media pretty much all my life. And one of the things I'm going to talk about is how news has changed so much. And news has really changed a lot since I was a kid. Back when I was a kid, we only had the 3 broadcast networks and whatnot. We would have news at 6 p.m. and news at 11 p.m. and there would be a network news telecast at 6:30 or 7 p.m. depending on if your local news was an hour. You didn't have all the local news. You barely had morning news. There wasn't that many midday news reports because back then, 40, 50 years ago, news wasn't seen as profitable back then, or as profitable as it eventually became. And I'm going to talk in this about the movie Network, and I need to really rewatch that movie. And part of the reason I'm going to talk about that is because that movie, in many ways, has really made me realize that a lot of what we see today, and the distrust of the media, the fact that it's no longer about the news, it's about what I call infotainment, or what's commonly called as infotainment, has taken place. News is not there to inform you anymore. News is there to entertain you. For example, Fox News is not legally considered a news network. It's considered an entertainment network. And they've gone to great lengths to, in the courts, when they get sued by someone who accuses them of twisting the truth around, of saying that they're not an actual news network, and that people like Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity would not be believed by a rational person. Must be a lot of irrational people out there these days. But here's the thing. This isn't anything new. And I've talked about this on this podcast before, and I'll go into even more greater detail when I do my book. But everything changed in I think it was 1987, when they got rid of the Fairness Doctrine. And the Fairness Doctrine, back then, before it got taken out, was basically where radio and TV news programs, or whatever, when they did a news story, they had to basically give you both sides of the story. Thus, the fairness part of it. And the thing about this is that it was about making sure that all sides were represented. Well, Reagan, in his wisdom, or more than likely the people who were paying Reagan at the time, and politicians like Reagan, wanted to change the rules so they can slant their views a certain way. And they did this by basically saying, hey, the traditional news media is so-called liberally biased. Now, they did this because they preyed upon the ignorance of people in the so-called flyover states, mainly the places that weren't New York and Los Angeles, that apparently, in their view, were not well represented in the media. This is an old tactic. Pretty much old as you can get. And the reason that this has been successful is there is this sense in this country that places like New York and Los Angeles and Washington, big cities as such, do not understand what quote unquote real Americans are about, or what they believe in, and who they are. And you note the word real Americans. And when I talk about real Americans, and I'm still, by the way, if you hear some bad noise, I'm using a new setup on my Chromebook to record this thing so I can record it on my headset. So, the thing about this is that this has been going on for centuries. It goes beyond even when America was a country. There has always been a disconnect between urban areas and rural areas, because urban areas tend to be where lots of people from diverse backgrounds gather together, and their views are challenged, and they come together and they talk it out, and basically they tend to lean more liberal because there's a wide variety of viewpoints. Whereas in rural areas, like I live in, there's a lot of homogeneity. Homogeneous. Whatever. I can't say that damn word, sorry. There tends to be a lot of people that are a lot alike. And in this area, there's a lot of white people. A lot of very conservative white people, a lot of evangelical white people. And they tend to look at the world in very similar ways. And for those who don't look at it a similar way, they tend to be a bit of an outcast, which is nothing new, but it is what it is. So, I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about how religion and politics have mixed to the point where it's almost unrecognizable now, and it's kind of damaged both of them, and why it's a very bad thing. I'm going to talk about how modern Hollywood culture is about basically like the rest of media culture, basically stuff to just keep you glued, and why we don't have the originality in movies and television like we had in the 70s and even into the 80s, and why a lot of what we see and read today or hear today is very much kind of bland. There is some edginess out there, and that's why I'll talk about why it's so very important for streaming platforms and premium stations like HBO, Showtime, and Stars to retain their independence, to be able to show the edgier stuff that you wouldn't see on, say, NBC, ABC, CBS, or even basic cable nowadays. There's some edgy stuff on basic cable, but not really nearly as much. So I'll talk about plenty of that. So this is going to be a pretty big book. 50,000 words is a novel size, but I'll write way more than that. So anyhow, I wanted to come on here, and basically it's been a while since I did one of these things. I need to do more of them. So anyhow, that's all for now. Thank you for listening. Hope you have a great day.